The forest did not merely surround Vaelthorn Manor, it consumed it, as a tide of black water consumes a drowning man, slowly and without mercy. The trees here were ancient beyond reckoning, their trunks swollen and warped into shapes that bore no honest relation to the natural world. Bark had fused into expressions, not faces precisely, but suggestions of faces, hollow depressions where eyes might have been, ridges where mouths might have stretched into permanent silent screams. The branches overhead laced together into a canopy so dense that even the grey November sky was reduced to a rumour, visible only in fractured slivers between the black lattice of wood. No birds nested in those heights. No creature dug its burrow among those roots. The forest lived, if living was the correct word, in a state of profound and hostile stillness, as though every organism within it had learned, through generations of proximity, that silence was the only form of survival. The road that wound toward the manor, if road was a word generous enough to describe it, was little more than a memory impressed into the earth. It had been a proper road once, centuries past, paved with flat stones cut and laid by hands long since turned to dust. Now those stones had been swallowed almost entirely by the dark, spongy soil of the forest floor, rising here and there in jagged teeth of pale grey rock, slick with moss, treacherous as the intentions of the place itself. The wheel ruts of carriages that had last passed this way were still faintly visible if one knew precisely where to look, pressed into the earth like wounds that had never properly healed, the soft ground never having recovered its original shape after the weight of iron wheels and heavy horses had violated it. Beyond the tree line, if one persevered, if one's nerves held firm against the whispering dread that accumulated with every step deeper into the wood, the manor materialized from the darkness the way a nightmare materializes from the threshold of sleep. It did not announce itself. It simply was, suddenly and overwhelmingly present, looming against the sky with the casual authority of something that had existed long before the concept of announcement was ever conceived. The structure was immense, a sprawling mass of dark stone that had spread and grown and been added to across centuries, with all the organic irregularity of a living thing. No single architectural vision had conceived it whole. Instead, it had accrued, tower by tower, wing by wing, cellar below cellar, as each generation of inhabitants had impressed their obsessions and their fears upon the stone. The original medieval keep rose at the center, its walls 3 meters thick in places, its narrow windows like vertical wounds in the masonry. Around it had grown the eastern residential wing, its construction slightly more refined, its stonework the product of slightly more sophisticated tools and slightly less desperate circumstances. To the west sprawled the grand hall extension, its proportions more baroque, its cornices more ornate, the ambitions of whatever architect had designed it clearly outstripping the practical realities of the site, and perhaps of the physics of weight and balance. A tower rose at each of the 4 cardinal points of the central keep, and each tower was different in height and girth, as though in competition with the others, each straining toward the sky with its own idiosyncratic urgency. But the grandeur, and there had been grandeur here once, unarguable and awe-inspiring, was thoroughly and irreversibly violated by decay. Time had worked upon Vaelthorn Manor with the focused patience of an obsessive sculptor, not creating but destroying, peeling away the pretensions of civilized construction to reveal the raw stone beneath, the honest ruin that lay inside every human attempt at permanence. Entire sections of the eastern wing had collapsed, the fallen stonework creating interior landscapes of rubble through which the wild had eagerly colonized. Vines had worked their tendrils into every crack and had over the decades pried those cracks wider. Patient as any siege, relentless as any army, the vines had climbed the walls and reached the towers, and in places had nearly smothered the stone entirely, so that sections of the manor appeared to be draped in a dark green funeral shroud. The windows, Those that had not been boarded or simply fallen from their frames entirely still held their original glass in places, thick and imperfect glass that distorted the light passing through it in ways that seemed somehow intentional. The largest windows in the Grand Hall extension were of stained glass, the leading still largely intact, though several panes had been lost and replaced over the centuries with plain glass that inserted jarring notes of transparency into scenes of elaborate religious and heraldic iconography. These stained windows depicted, in the tradition of their medieval commissioning, the founding mythology of a noble house, but the scenes were strange by any conventional standard. Where other noble houses might have commissioned images of saints or holy battles, the windows of Vaelthorn depicted scenes of transformation, of figures dissolving into mist or shadow, of blood offered and received in rituals that no legitimate church would have sanctioned or recognized. The central figure in the largest window was tall, regal, ancient in bearing, dressed in robes that combined the ecclesiastical with the martial, and held in one outstretched hand something that resembled a chalice but was open at the top in a way that allowed whatever it contained to spill, and whatever spilled from it was rendered in deep crimson glass, vivid and undimmed even after centuries, catching whatever light was available and throwing it back transformed, red as fresh wounds, red as the sky at the hour before a storm. The grounds around the manor had once been formal gardens. The bones of that formality still persisted, the geometrical outlines of planting beds, the remnants of gravel paths, the ruins of what had been a substantial fountain at the center of the forecourt. The fountain's basin had cracked, and the central sculpture, figures entwined in something between an embrace and a struggle, had partially collapsed, the upper bodies of the figures now lying in the dry basin amid fallen leaves and the dark droppings of the only birds that ventured this close to the manor. Ravens, large and glossy-feathered, that perched on the broken sculptures in the manor's crumbling battlements with the proprietary ease of long-time tenants. Above all of this, on the night that the manor's long dormancy came to its violent end, the moon hung full and red. It was the kind of moon that inspired ancient peoples to sacrifice and to prayer, a moon the color of open flesh, swollen at the horizon to a size that seemed physically impossible, its surface visible in unusual clarity, its craters and seas mapped in shades of rust and dried blood against the brighter crimson of its face. The clouds that moved across it were dark and heavy with a storm that had been building over the forest for 3 days, their undersides stained the color of bruises by the moon's disturbing light. No wind moved in the courtyard. The vines were still. The ravens on the battlements had drawn their feathers close and sat in attitudes of vigilance, their orange eyes catching the red moonlight and holding it in twin points of amber fire. The manor itself seemed, in this stillness, to be listening. The quality of the silence around it was not the silence of emptiness, but the silence of held breath, the silence of something vast and patient waiting for a signal that only it could recognize. Within the manor's walls, time had not moved so much as accumulated, layer upon layer, century upon century, each era depositing its residue over the last until the interior spaces had achieved a density of atmosphere that was almost physically palpable, something one moved through rather than simply occupied. The air in the great entrance hall tasted of centuries of cold stone, of dust in which the cells of long-dead bodies were mixed with the spores of fungi and the ancient particles of burned wax from thousands of extinguished candles. It tasted of moisture and of rot, and beneath those more immediate flavors, of something older and more specific, the mineral sharpness of very old blood, soaked into the stone in quantities sufficient to permanently alter the chemistry of the air. The entrance hall was vast, its ceiling lost in darkness above the reach of the 8 iron candelabra that lined the walls. These candelabra, each standing as tall as a man, each bearing 12 black candles, were burning. This was the first indication, for any perceptive observer, that the manor's dormancy was not as complete as the exterior suggested. The candles burned without visible agency, without any apparent human hand to have lit them, and had clearly been burning for some time. Wax had pooled and dripped and hardened on the iron bases of the candelabra, suggesting hours of continuous flame. Their light was inadequate to the scale of the space, producing an effect not of illumination but of intensified shadow, the pools of amber light serving primarily to define the vastness of the darkness surrounding them. The floor of the entrance hall was black marble, its surface still largely intact and polished enough, in places, to reflect the candle flames in dim, distorted echoes. The reflections shifted with each slight movement of the flames, producing the unnerving impression that figures moved just beneath the marble surface, dark shapes shifting in response to no observable stimulus. A grand staircase rose at the far end of the hall, its stone balustrades carved into a repeating motif of serpents consuming their own tails, the ancient symbol of eternity rendered here with an obsessive attention to anatomical detail that bordered on the disturbing. The serpents' scales had been individually incised, their eyes set with small stones of deep red garnet that caught the candlelight and burned with organic intensity. The staircase split at the first landing, one arm rising to the right toward the east wing, the other curving left toward the west, and at the point of division stood a statue on a marble plinth, a figure in armor, full plate from foot to gorget, but with the helmet removed so that the face was visible. The face was extraordinary. It was the face of a man perhaps 40 years of age at the apparent time of the statue's carving, lean and angular with high, sharp cheekbones and deep-set eyes, whose stone irises had been given an unusual treatment, rather than the flat smoothness typical of such sculpture. The irises had been carved with fine radial lines that gave them an unsettling illusion of depth, of actual eyes looking out from stone. Around the armored figure's neck, carved in evident deliberate detail, hung a medallion on a heavy chain, its face too small and too high to read from the floor of the entrance hall. Portraits lined the walls of the entrance hall, hung in frames that ranged from simple carved wood to elaborate gilt constructions, their size ranging from modest to enormous. The portraits spanned, judging by the styles of dress and painting visible, at least 7 centuries. The earliest were painted in the flat, formal style of medieval illumination, the figures rigid and hieratic, their eyes gazing forward with the fixed intensity of icons rather than representations of actual human beings. The later portraits approached greater naturalism, and this progress toward realism made the subjects more rather than less disturbing. With each century, the technique improved, the illusion of flesh deepened, the simulation of life grew more convincing, but the figures in the portraits, always aristocratic, always dressed in the finest garments of their era, always regarding the viewer with expressions of cool, assured authority, shared certain features across all the centuries of their painting. The bones beneath the skin were always the same bones, high and angular and precise. The eyes, regardless of their color in each portrait, were always rendered with that same quality of depth, of looking, of genuine and focused attention that no painter achieves accidentally. And every subject in every portrait, from the earliest medieval icon to the most recent of perhaps a century and a half ago, wore at their neck, on chains of varying metal and style, the same medallion. The long gallery that connected the entrance hall to the east wing held a different kind of historical record. Here the walls bore not portraits, but tapestries, and the tapestries told stories. They were immense, floor to ceiling in some places. Their wool threads faded to muted versions of what must once have been vivid color, their surfaces dense with imagery, rendered in the stylized visual language of medieval craft. The story they told was not immediately legible to any eye untrained in the specific iconography of the house's mythology, but the broad shapes of the narrative were visible, armies meeting in battle, figures of evident power and authority standing over the fallen, rituals performed in spaces that bore architectural similarities to the interior of the manor itself. In several panels, 2 groups faced each other across a space filled with what the tapestry maker had rendered in dark red thread, rivers of it, lakes of it, the space between the two groups saturated with red thread until the background itself seemed to bleed. In the final tapestry, hung alone on the wall at the gallery's end, larger than all the others, its condition worse, its colors more deeply faded, a single figure stood at the center of a scene of utter devastation. All around this figure were the suggestions of fallen forms, of ruin, of aftermath. The central figure stood alone and upright amid the desolation, and though the wool threads that composed its face had faded nearly to the background color of the tapestry, something in the posture, in the set of the figure's shoulders and the angle of its head, communicated not victory but the particular desolation of a survivor who has outlasted everything that made survival worthwhile. At the heart of the west wing, accessible through a pair of doors so large that their hinges had been set into the wall rather than the door frame, the grand ballroom existed in a state of preserved ruin that was, in its own devastated way, the most beautiful space in the manor. It occupied the full height of the west wing, 3 stories from floor to the ceiling's frescoed vault, its walls lined with Corinthian pilasters of pale stone between which tall mirrors alternated with the tall stained glass windows. The mirrors, their silvering degraded by centuries, returned imperfect reflections, images that were blurred and darkened, that seemed to show versions of the room slightly different from the room itself, as though the mirrors were not reflecting the present space but some other time's version of it, an earlier or a later incarnation of the ballroom caught in the silver and preserved there, while the actual room aged around it. The floor was white marble inlaid with a complex pattern in black and dark red marble. The pattern a geometric construction that, viewed from the gallery above, resolved into a design of interlocking circles and angular forms that were not quite any conventional heraldic symbol but bore unsettling similarities to certain esoteric diagrams, certain diagrams found in texts that legitimate scholarship preferred not to discuss. The floor's surface was obscured in places by fallen plaster from the ceiling above, by the accumulated dust and debris of long unoccupancy, and in one corner by a section of collapsed roof that had allowed decades of rain and wind to penetrate, creating a zone of severe damage where black mold spread across the marble in organic patterns, and the floor itself had begun to heave and crack as the moisture destroyed the bonding beneath. The chandelier that had once hung at the ballroom's center had fallen at some point in the past 2 centuries, and its remains lay on the floor below the point of its fall, an extraordinary wreckage of crystal and iron, thousands of individual crystal drops scattered across the marble, catching the moonlight that entered through the damaged section of ceiling and returning it as fragments of colored light that moved across the floor as the clouds moved across the moon. The effect was hallucinatory. The floor of the ballroom appeared, in these fleeting moments of moving light, to be alive with something. Figures dancing, perhaps, or figures fighting. The distinction between the two motions collapsing under the conditions of such oblique and intermittent illumination. It was in the ballroom on the night the red moon rose that the first movement occurred. The sound, when it came, was not loud. It was a sound that traveled not through the air but through the stone itself, a deep vibration that the walls of the manor transmitted the way bones transmit sound to the inner ear, directly, intimately, bypassing the intermediary of open space. It was felt as much as heard, a thrum in the soles of feet on cold marble, a resonance in the chest's hollow spaces, a pressure in the skull that was not quite pain. It came from below, beneath the grand ballroom, beneath the east wing, beneath the entrance hall and the long gallery and the kitchens and the servants' passages that honeycombed the lower levels of the manor. There were the cellars, and beneath the cellars there were the crypts. The crypts of Vaelthorn Manor were not, properly speaking, the burial crypts of any conventional noble house, though they had been represented as such when the manor's history had been catalogued by the occasional scholar who ventured this far from civilization and this close to the forest's heart. The official record, such as it existed, described a network of subterranean chambers constructed in the 13th century as both burial space and storage, connected by a system of passages that had been extended and modified in subsequent centuries as the manor above them grew. The official record was not false precisely. It simply described the function without touching the meaning. The actual crypts were older than the 13th century manor. They were older, in fact, than anything above them, older than the medieval keep, older perhaps than the road that had once approached through the forest. They had been here before the manor. The manor had been built above them, had always been built around them, had always existed in service to them, whether or not the human architects who laid the stones above understood the nature of the foundation they were building upon. The crypts were the origin, and the manor was the consequence. The chambers of the upper crypt were the ones that had been catalogued. Vaulted spaces lined with stone sarcophagi bearing the effigies of the noble dead, their carved faces wearing the same high, angular bone structure visible in the portraits above, their stone hands clasped over stone chests that held no bodies, had never held bodies, the sarcophagi being cenotaphs, memorials to absences, markers of something other than death. Between the sarcophagi, iron brackets held the stumps of candles that had not been lit in decades, and the bracket arms bore the same serpent consuming its tail motif as the staircase balustrades above. The walls between the brackets were carved, every surface of every wall covered in bas-relief so dense that no clear stone showed through. Figures, scenes, symbols, text in alphabets that were not any modern language and not any classical language that legitimate scholarship had ever fully decoded. The carvings covered not only the walls but the ceiling of each chamber, the floors, the sarcophagi themselves, every available surface given over to this obsessive inscription of a narrative that wound through the chambers without visible beginning or end, its story continuous and circular. The deeper chambers, the ones below the ones that had been catalogued, the ones accessible only through passages concealed behind sections of the carved walls, passages whose existence had never been recorded in any official document, were different. They were older in their construction, rougher, their walls not carved but painted in pigments that had proved astonishingly resistant to the centuries. Ochre and charcoal, and a deep brownish red that owed its persistence to its medium, which analysis would have revealed to be not mineral pigment at all, but something organic and thickened by age. These passages and chambers were dry, which was itself remarkable given the depth at which they sat, and the moisture that pervaded the forest above. They were dry because of something in the stone itself, some property of the particular rock from which they had been carved, a rock darker than the limestone of the upper crypts, almost black in its natural state, with a faint luminescence when one pressed a hand against it, not quite phosphorescence, not quite warmth, but something in between, something that defied the vocabulary of natural phenomena. It was from these deepest chambers that the vibration rose. Lord Aldrich Vaelthorn. He had been still for so long that the stillness had become a kind of substance, dense and layered, surrounding him the way amber surrounds an insect, preserving without consciousness. In the deepest chamber, in the stone chair that had been carved from the living rock of the chamber's heart, carved and then worn smooth by centuries of occupation, the stone arms shaped by the grip of hands that had rested there so long and so repeatedly, that the stone itself had yielded to the pressure of those hands, had shaped itself around them, Aldrich Vaelthorn sat. He was the manor, not in any metaphorical or sentimental sense, but in the most literal way that such a statement could be interpreted. The manor had been constructed around his existence, each stone placed in relationship to where he was and what he required, the architecture an externalization of his nature, the floor plan a map of his psychology, the towers reaching toward the sky an imitation of the ambitions that had defined his long, long life. He had not always sat in the deep chamber. There had been centuries, plural, when he had moved through the rooms above with the ease of complete proprietorship, when the manor had been full of life, his kind's life, a life that burned at frequencies not visible to human senses but blazing nonetheless, incandescent in its way, fierce in its appetites, magnificent in its cold splendor. Those centuries were behind him. How far behind him was a question that had become meaningless at some point. during the long stillness, during the quiescence he had chosen. Chosen was the precise word. This was not death, not the end, but a withdrawal, a deliberate dimming of all the lights that burned within him until he was nothing but potential, preserved, waiting. He became aware of himself incrementally, the way a man surfaces from deep water, each threshold of depth requiring its own adjustment before the next could be approached. The first awareness was of stone, cold, familiar, ancient stone, the stone of the chair, the stone of the chamber walls, the stone of the floor beneath his unmoving feet. Then came awareness of temperature, the deep chill of the earth, unchanged through all the centuries he had sat here, consistent and reliable as nothing above ground had ever been. Then came the awareness of the vibration, the source of which was not physical in any conventional sense, but was rather the trembling of something he had no better word for than the blood, the vast, invisible medium in which all of his kind existed and through which they transmitted and received, the substrate of supernatural existence that connected him to every other being of his nature, and through them to the wider world of the living and the dead. The vibration told him things. It told him first that something approached, not from without, not from the forest road, not from the direction of the human world beyond the tree line, from within the manor itself and from within the blood. Another presence, another concentration of the old power, moving with the intent that only one kind of being moved with, purposeful and predatory and ancient in its own right. It told him second that this approaching presence was not alone. He had been still for long enough that the process of becoming unstill required significant effort. Not the effort of weakness, but the effort of reawakening, of persuading a system that had achieved profound equilibrium to abandon that equilibrium and begin once again the work of being. His first movement was his eyes. They opened without the biological necessity of opening that human eyes require. There was no transition from the blackness of closed lids to the blackness of the chamber, only a sudden shift from not seeing to seeing, a rearrangement of his relationship to the darkness that was, for him, not the absence of light, but a medium with its own qualities, its own gradations, its own legible landscape of heat and cold and movement. The chamber resolved around him, 40 feet across, roughly oval, its ceiling arched, the black stone walls covered in the old paintings, their pigment still vibrant, still speaking, the iron brackets empty of candles, the single passage entrance carved into the wall to his left, its proportions exactly matched to his own proportions, deliberately so, a door shaped to one body and one body only. On the wall directly opposite him, the wall he faced, the wall that had been his horizon through all the long stillness, the painting was different from the others. Where the other walls showed scenes, figures, narrative, this wall showed a single image rendered at enormous scale, covering the entire wall from floor to ceiling and from corner to corner. 2 trees, their trunks intertwined in a way that suggested either alliance or combat, their roots descending below the bottom edge of the painting, their branches ascending above the top, and at the point of their intertwining, at the exact center of the wall, a wound, a gash in both trunks where they pressed together, and from this wound dripping, in the dark red pigment, a slow suggestion of blood. He looked at this painting for a long time after his eyes opened. He had looked at it for centuries. He knew every crack in the pigment, every place where the stone beneath had shifted minutely and altered the image in ways imperceptible to any eye less attentive than his own. He had meditated on it, had cursed it, had made his peace with it repeatedly, and then found that peace inadequate and cursed it again. The painting was prophecy and history at once, a statement of something that had been true and something that would be true again. A loop of time captured in ochre and charcoal and old blood on stone. His hands moved finally. They lifted from the arms of the stone chair, lifted from the impressions they had worn in the stone, the impressions of his own grip preserved in solid rock, and he looked at them in the darkness that was not darkness to him. Long hands, pale as marble, the skin unmarked by age in any human sense, but bearing its own record of time in subtler ways, in the particular density of it, in the way light would have moved across it under illumination, in something in its quality that was not the quality of living skin, that had not been the quality of living skin for more centuries than the stones of this manor had been assembled. The vibration intensified. They were closer now. This, what blood remembers. The name came to him without effort, without choice. Morthis, the House of Morthis. The other tree on the wall. Memory in Aldrich was not the fallible, partial, chronologically confused thing that memory is for beings who live and die within the span of decades. Memory for him was more like architecture, permanent, structural, inhabiting the same space as the present, rather than retreating into a separate chamber of the past. He did not remember the House of Morthis the way a human might remember a childhood enemy. He inhabited his memory of them the way he inhabited the manor, as a space that was always present and always his. He remembered the beginning, in the century that the educated world now called the 11th, though the calendar he had lived by then used different names for the turnings of years. The forest had been younger, and the manor had not yet existed, and the world beyond the tree line had been a place of extraordinary violence, of kingdoms hammering against each other in the relentless percussion of medieval warfare, of populations living and dying in the shadow of powers they could not see and barely comprehended. The being who would become Aldrich Vaelthorn hadn't been born to his particular existence. He had been taken into it, not unwillingly, which was a matter of significance and honor, not as violation but as elevation, as initiation into a covenant that predated every human institution and would outlast them all. His maker had been a creature of astonishing age even then, a being whose origins lay in a time before the Roman world had collapsed, before the dark centuries had swallowed classical civilization, perhaps before civilization as the word was then understood had assembled itself from its earlier, rougher constituents. What his maker had been before the making, human, something other, something in between, was knowledge that had never been shared and that Aldrich had long since stopped requiring. The covenant of blood that had been the foundation of his making had also been from its earliest hours a covenant that existed in opposition to another covenant. The House of Morthis had not been created by the same maker. It had arisen through a different lineage, a different transmission of the old power, a different initiation performed by different hands in a different part of the world, and carrying, as a result, a different character, a different quality of the thing that bound them all. Where the Vaelthorn bloodline ran cold, literally, measurably cold, the skins of its members always several degrees below the ambient temperature of whatever space they occupied, their particular power operating through a kind of absolute stillness at its most intense, through the cessation of motion and warmth and light. The Morthis bloodline ran hot, not in any human sense of warmth, but in the sense of activity, of motion, of the expression of power through movement and through the manipulation of what moved. Blood was their particular domain, the blood that flowed in living vessels, yes, but also the blood as medium, as substance, as force. They could reach into the living and the near dead and move the blood as a puppet master moves a marionette, could feel through blood the way others feel through air, could project their will through it with a precision and intensity that had always been, for Aldrich and his line, a source of both admiration and deep unease. The war between the two bloodlines was not, as the tapestries in the gallery above might have suggested to a hasty observer, an ancient grudge born of a single offense or a single atrocity. It was something more complex and more permanent than grudge. It was the expression of a fundamental incompatibility, of two cosmologies that could not coexist without one consuming the other, of two philosophies of immortal existence so different in their premises that every point of contact between the two became inevitably a point of conflict. The Vaelthorn philosophy was one of hierarchy, preservation, and restraint. Power was acknowledged but not celebrated. It was held in reserve, expressed only when necessary, its exercise always in service of larger and longer-term objectives. The living were a resource, necessary, renewable, to be managed rather than destroyed. The world above the crypt was a stage, and the immortal aristocracy who moved across it were not the players, but the directors, shaping the action from the wings without ever fully committing to the performance. The Morthis philosophy was its inversion. Power was the point. Power in itself, the experience of it, the expression of it, the watching of it work in the world. Where Vaelthorn preserved, Morthis consumed. Where Vaelthorn waited, Morthis moved. Where Vaelthorn hoarded centuries in stone, Morthis burned through decades in an ecstasy of dominance that was, Aldrich had always thought, the approach of a being that did not truly believe in its own immortality, that lived as though each century might be its last. With all the fierce, heedless intensity of something mortal, there had been a war, several wars. The earliest of them had occurred before the Manor existed, had been conducted across a landscape of dark forest and darker human politics, the two bloodlines using the mortal world as their battlefield and the mortal kingdoms as their infantry. That war had ended, not through victory for either side, not through peace in any meaningful sense, but through exhaustion and through circumstance, through the collapse of the particular set of conditions that had made warfare between them possible. They had retreated to their separate territories, separated by distance and by the unspoken agreement of beings who have discovered that destroying each other is more difficult than either had anticipated. That agreement had lasted centuries. Through the expansion of human civilization, through the plague centuries when the world of the living had contracted so violently that even immortals had felt the constriction, through the slow recovery and the age of exploration and the violent reorganization of everything, the two bloodlines had maintained their separation, maintained it through the conscious, effortful suppression of everything in their natures that inclined them toward collision. But agreements made between immortals do not end through breach of contract or through open declaration. They end through the slow accumulation of pressure, through the approach of conditions that make neutrality impossible, through the convergence of forces that were always going to converge, that had only ever been delayed. The red moon was a signal, not a symbol, an actual signal, one of the oldest and most specific in the vocabulary of their kind, its meaning not metaphorical but literal. The hour prophesied, the conditions fulfilled, the waiting over. She entered the Manor through the West Tower, which had been her entrance on every occasion she had entered this place across the centuries of her existence, not because it was the most convenient entrance and not because she was unaware of others. She used the West Tower entrance because she had forced it, in the beginning, in a demonstration of power that was also a statement of philosophy. She came where she chose to come, through barriers she chose to dissolve, because the distinction between invitation and intrusion was one that she had never found personally compelling. The tower's door had been sealed with iron and stone, and with something older than either, a ward of the blood, a concentration of Vaelthorn will impressed into the very substance of the entrance over centuries of deliberate reinforcement. To the senses of any lesser being, the door would have been simply a door. To Ceravain of Morthis, it was a message. This is ours. This does not want you. You are refused. She had received this message every time she had stood before this door in the centuries she had been standing before it. She had answered the message the same way every time, by pressing both palms flat against the cold stone of the door and pushing, not physically, not with the mechanical force of muscle and bone, but with the particular force that was her birthright, the force of blood and heat, and the absolute conviction of her own priority. The door had yielded. It always yielded. This was not because the ward was weak. It was not weak. It was among the most formidable constructions she had ever encountered, and she had encountered constructions that had taken other beings centuries to dissolve. It yielded because she was genuinely, extraordinarily powerful, and because the ward's resistance, considerable as it was finite, and her will was not. She stood in the tower's ground floor, and her 6 companions spread around her in the arrangement they had maintained for as long as they had been her companions. 2 before her, 2 behind, 1 to each side, a formation that combined protection with the visual rhetoric of court. She was always at the center, always the point from which all other positions were measured. Her companions were, all of them, old. 3 were older than the manor above them. 1 was, by any reasonable measure, as old as she was, though his power expressed itself differently, through illusion and transformation rather than the direct manipulation that was her specialty. She was beautiful in the way that very old things are beautiful, not with the beauty of youth, not with the beauty of freshness or vitality, but with the beauty of absolute clarity, of something stripped of everything inessential, of form refined to its purest expression by the long pressured passage of time. Her face was a landscape of precisely placed angles, of deep-set eyes that were the color of very old amber in good light and the color of dried blood in worse light, of a mouth that expressed neither warmth nor coldness, but something more specific and more disturbing: judgment. Perpetual, active, unflinching judgment of everything within her perception, rendered in the set of a mouth that had smiled in its time, at things that would have reduced a human observer to madness. She wore black, had worn black since a specific night in the 14th century that had persuaded her that all other colors were, for her purposes, inadequate, and the black she wore was not the black of fashion or convention, but the black of preference, of something that matched an interior quality more accurately than any other color available. Her gown moved with her as though it were a living thing, as though the fabric had been trained to her purposes over centuries of use, anticipating her movements and accommodating them with a fluid grace that was, in its own way, a demonstration of power. She did not announce herself. The manor knew she was here. The blood knew she was here. And somewhere in the deep stone below her feet, something old and cold and very still knew she was here, and was even now in the process of deciding how to respond. The 6 who moved with Ceravain through the upper passages of the manor were not her equals, but they were not merely servants. The hierarchy of the Morthis bloodline was built on the model of a military aristocracy, ranks defined not by birth. Birth was irrelevant. They had all been made, not born, but by age, by demonstrated power, and by the particular quality of loyalty that Ceravain valued above all other qualities: the willingness to act without instruction in service of her purposes, to interpret her will rather than merely execute her commands. The eldest of the 6 was Voss. He had been made in the same century as the manor, and had been with Ceravain for so long that the distinction between his will and hers had become, in most practical situations, irrelevant. He was not tall, but was built with the specific density of something very old and very compressed, as though his centuries had contracted him, pressing him into a form more concentrated and therefore more dangerous than his modest stature suggested. His eyes, in the dark corridors of Vaelthorn Manor, moved with the efficiency of absolute familiarity. He knew this place, had studied it, had mapped it in his memory with the painstaking care of someone who understood that in the coming hours, the knowledge of every passage and chamber and hidden turning would be the difference between success and its opposite. The others moved behind Voss with the silent precision of long-trained companions. Their footsteps on the cold stone floors were inaudible, not the inaudible of human stealth, not the careful suppression of sound through controlled movement, but the genuine silence of beings for whom sound was a choice rather than a consequence of motion. They could choose to make sound or not to make sound, and in the corridors of Vaelthorn they chose not to, moving through the candlelit passages like images projected on the walls, present and vivid and utterly without the acoustic signature of presence. The candles that lined the passages, black, dripping, burning without recent human assistance, illuminated a procession of horrors in quiet stone. Every passage in Vaelthorn Manor was lined with something: carved reliefs, mounted weapons, hung tapestries, shelved relics in cases of glass that had gone cloudy with age. The weapons were genuine, not decorative. Each one was a tool that had been used, cleaned, and mounted with the care given to instruments of proven efficacy, their edges still sharp enough after centuries of disuse to cut if touched carelessly. their metals treated with something that prevented the rust and decay that should have consumed them long ago. Cerevane moved through this environment the way she moved through everything, with possession, not with caution, not with the careful attention of someone navigating unfamiliar terrain, but with the ownership of someone claiming what had always been theirs by right, even if not yet in fact. She touched nothing as she moved, her hands at her sides or folded before her, but her attention moved like hands across the walls, feeling the architecture the way one feels, the architecture of an opponent's defense, reading its strengths and its weaknesses and its particular vulnerabilities with the practiced intimacy of someone who had been studying this question for a very long time. The Manor, for its part, did not receive her passively. Something in the stone responded to her presence, not with the warmth of welcome, but with the particular quality of activation that a complex machine has when a foreign element is introduced into its workings. The candle flames, as she passed beneath each candelabra, bent away from her rather than toward her, as though repelled. The temperature in each room she entered dropped several degrees below its baseline chill, the cold that was always present in these stone spaces intensifying in response to the heat she carried. The shadows moved marginally, in directions inconsistent with the candle flame's behavior. Shadows that should have fallen to the right, falling to the left. Shadows that should have diminished with proximity to a flame, deepening instead, as though the light sources were behaving differently in different regions of the same room, as though the room itself was arguing with the physics of light. None of this deterred Cerevane. She had expected it. She had always expected it. The Manor's resistance was part of the encounter, part of the particular pleasure of this particular confrontation. She had never been a being who sought the path of least resistance. The resistance was, in a sense, the point. Hence, Aldrich had, by the time Cerevane reached the upper levels, fully reoccupied himself. This was not a quick process. Centuries of stillness created a kind of inertia that was not physical. The body, such as it was, had its own processes for returning from quiescence, and these were essentially complete within an hour of first waking. The inertia that required more careful management was psychological, the vast accumulation of everything that had been suspended during the long stillness, every consideration set aside, every unresolved tension left in its frozen state. These thawed as wakefulness returned, and they thawed in no particular order and with no respect for his preference for systematic management. He felt the Manor as he walked its lower passages, felt it the way one feels a body that one has inhabited for centuries, every ache and damage and violation immediately present to his attention. The collapsed section of the east wing, the breach in the west tower, the profound cold of the deep chambers, colder even than the rest of the Manor's cold, a cold that was not natural, a cold that had its source in him, that he had generated in his long stillness and that had spread outward through the stone. He felt the candles, felt them as extensions of something he had, long ago, impressed into the Manor's substance, a thread of will woven into the wax and iron of every candelabra, a standing instruction that the light be maintained, that the Manor never be entirely dark. He had left this instruction standing when he went into the deep chamber, and it had been honored in his absence, the candles burning through centuries, renewed by what mechanism he could not have explained in any terms that would have satisfied a natural philosopher's inquiry, but renewed nonetheless. He felt her, felt the six with her, felt the particular signature of Morthis in the upper passages the way one feels an infection in a limb, not pain precisely, but a wrongness, a foreignness, a presence that did not belong and that the body registered with all the precision of an immune system encountering a known pathogen. He was in the vaulted chamber at the base of the great staircase, the chamber that connected the upper and lower crypts, that served as the architecturally ambiguous space between the world above and the world below. When he first heard her footsteps, he heard them not through the air but through the stone, transmitted through the floor and the walls and the carved serpents of the balustrade, and the quality of the footsteps told him things. Pace, weight, intention. The pace was deliberate but not hurried. The weight was the weight of something dense and old despite the slenderness of the form. The intention was the intention of arrival, of coming to a place long anticipated. He waited in the vaulted chamber, He stood at its center beneath the arch that connected the lower stairs to the passage toward the eastern crypts, and he waited with the quality of stillness that was his nature and his most powerful expression, a stillness so absolute that the candle flames near him burned straight and unmoving as though the air around them had solidified. She would come to him. She always came to him here. The geography of their encounters was always the same, had always been the same, an arrangement whose origin neither of them could or would identify, whether by Seravain's preference, or by the Manor's own direction, or by some protocol embedded in the blood itself that they both followed without entirely understanding. She would come to him here in this chamber, and they would stand in the cold candlelit dark, and the war between them would take place, first in the silence between their bodies, in the space where two incompatible cosmologies met and pressed against each other, with all the geological force of tectonic boundaries. When she appeared at the top of the descending stair, the 6 shadows of her companions behind her, Aldrich looked at her across the stone chamber with eyes that had looked at her across centuries, and had never in all those centuries found the sight unremarkable. There were places in the deep crypts where the walls curved inward, where the 2 sides of a passage narrowed to the width of a single body, and the ceiling descended to within a hand's breadth of the tallest head, and in these constrictions the carvings that covered every other surface were replaced by something different. Not relief carvings, not painted scenes, but text carved directly into the black stone with a precision and a depth that spoke of tools other than the metal and stone implements available to any human craftsman of the period in which the crypts had been constructed. The letters were not the letters of any language currently spoken or written, but they bore family resemblances to several, traces of a Proto-Semitic root here, a phonetic structure that echoed archaic Indo-European there, suggesting an origin in the deep past before the linguistic divergences that separated those families, in a proto-language whose existence linguistic scholarship had occasionally hypothesized and never proved. Aldrich had been reading this text for centuries. He had been reading it the way a scholar reads a text in a language he is still learning, with increasing fluency, with increasing dread, with the particular horror of watching comprehension deepen around a meaning that was never, at any point in the process of comprehension, remotely welcome. The text was prophecy. This much had been clear from his earliest readings, from the first century of his occupation of the manor, when he had pressed his palms against the stone and felt the words before he could interpret them, felt the weight of what they were and what they said with the body rather than the intellect. The specific content of the prophecy had taken longer than his existence felt long to him, which was considerably longer than the word long suggests to any being with a mortal lifespan. The prophecy spoke of the 2 bloodlines. It spoke of Vaelthorn and Morthis, though it used older names that predated the families themselves, names that referred to the qualities each bloodline carried, rather than to the individuals who bore those qualities, the still blood and the moving blood. It spoke of the red moon, using a term that was astronomical in its precision, that specified a lunar configuration occurring on a cycle of several centuries. It spoke of the manor, referring to it by a name that predated even Aldrich's memory of the place, a name that meant, as closely as he had been able to translate it, something like the hinge point, not a place but a function, a point at which the balance of powers in the invisible world tipped one way or another, a fulcrum. The prophecy said that when the red moon of the cycle rose over the hinge point, the war between the still blood and the moving blood would be decided, not deferred, not interrupted, not negotiated into another interval of cold peace, decided, concluded, ended one way or another in a permanence that the text expressed with a grammatical construction whose certainty admitted no ambiguity whatsoever. What was prophesied would be, the stone said with the same flat authority with which stone says all its statements. And the prophecy said something else, something for which Aldrich had never found an entirely satisfactory translation, that resisted interpretation with a stubbornness that he had come to suspect was intentional. The authors of the text, whoever they had been, had built into this particular passage a complexity of meaning that made certainty impossible. that preserved a fundamental ambiguity about whether the outcome of the decided war would be victory for the still blood, victory for the moving blood, or the extinction of both. This ambiguity and what lay beneath it was the reason for the relic, deeper than the deep chambers, deeper than the passages with their ancient text, deeper than anywhere House Morthis had ever penetrated in her centuries of effort. And she had made the effort more than once, had sent others when she could not go herself, had invested resources and will, and the expenditure of carefully accumulated knowledge in the attempt to reach the chamber she knew must exist below the lowest level she had accessed. Deeper than all of that, in a chamber that the manor had not so much concealed as protected with every layer of its architecture and its will and the accumulated power of centuries of Vaelthorn occupancy, was the relic. Aldrich had not been to this chamber in the current period of his waking. He went there now, descending through the passages that responded to his presence with the absolute openness of a body, welcoming blood back to its extremities, every ward dissolving before him, every sealed passage opening. He went down through the still air and the deep cold and the silence that was not like any silence above, a silence that was not the absence of sound, but the presence of something older and denser than sound, a silence that had substance, that pressed against the ears not with emptiness but with a kind of acoustic pressure, as though the air itself was holding its breath. The relic's chamber was circular, small, 10 feet across perhaps, and entirely plain, the walls uncarved and unpainted, the floor flat and featureless, the ceiling low. In any other context it would have been unremarkable, a storage space, a cistern, a room defined by its emptiness. What made it remarkable was the object at its center, on a plinth of the same black stone as the walls, rising 2 feet from the floor. The relic rested. It was, in its material substance, a chalice, the same chalice depicted in the great stained glass window of the ballroom above, the same chalice worn at the neck of every figure in every portrait that lined the entrance hall, miniaturized to a pendant scale. The correspondence was not metaphorical. This was the original, the object from which the representations had been made, the thing that had been reproduced in glass and paint and carved stone across centuries as an act of remembrance and of worship. Its material was not metal, or not any metal that mining or metallurgy produced. It was dark, the color of very old iron, but its surface moved when light fell on it, moved in the way oil moves on water, in slow, iridescent waves of color that the darkness of the base color made visible only in direct illumination, a subsurface shimmer of deep blue and green, and something at the edges of the visible spectrum that registered not as color but as sensation, a faint vibration in the eye that was almost, but not quite, pain. Aldrich stood before it and felt its pull the way he always felt its pull, as hunger, as the specific, precise hunger of someone who has been fasting and who understands the precise nature of what they are fasting from, who feels the absence not as an unspecified craving, but as the exact shape of the thing they are refusing. The relic was the thing that the prophecy had identified as the instrument of conclusion, not a weapon in any conventional sense, but something through which power could be focused and expressed at a magnitude that exceeded anything achievable through individual will. It was the amplifier, the lever, the fulcrum's fulcrum, the mechanism by which the balance of the invisible world could be tipped decisively and permanently toward one bloodline or the other. Whoever held the relic when the red moon reached its zenith over the manor would determine the outcome of what the prophecy had declared inevitable, the concluded war, the decided question, the end of the long centuries of cold standoff, and the beginning of whatever came after. He had kept the relic here, below all else, behind every defense, for the very specific reason that he had not, in all the centuries of his long reflection, been certain enough of the prophecy's meaning to use it. The ambiguity in the text, the possibility that the outcome of use might be extinction for both bloodlines rather than victory for one, had functioned as the most reliable form of restraint he had ever encountered. He was old and powerful and entirely capable of terrible things, but he was not indifferent to his own continued existence. and the risk that using the relic might end him along with Ceravain was a risk he had never been able to fully dismiss. But the red moon was rising. The prophesied hour had arrived, and Ceravain was in his house, moving through his passages with her 6 companions, and with purposes that were perfectly legible to him across the full span of centuries they had spent in opposition. And the question of whether to use the relic had moved from the realm of strategy into the realm of necessity, with a sudden velocity that left very little room for further reflection. What Ceravain did not know, or more precisely what she had not yet discovered, though the discovery was hours away from her at most, was that Voss had been in contact with Aldrich. The contact had been indirect, as all contact between the 2 bloodlines was when not conducted in conditions of open confrontation, through intermediaries who were themselves not members of either line, through communications conducted in the deep medium of the blood itself, through the exchange of what amounted to a single message conveyed across the distance between their 2 territories over the course of several months. The message that the long standoff was ending, that the prophesied hour was coming, and that there were individuals on each side of the line who questioned whether the outcome the prophecy intended was the outcome that either side truly wanted. Voss was old enough to be afraid of what the relic could do. He was old enough to remember the last time, not the last use of the relic, which had not occurred in any time he had direct memory of, but the last time power of comparable magnitude had been expressed in the world, and what the aftermath of that expression had looked like, and how long the aftermath had lasted and how much had been lost. He was old enough, in short, to not want what Ceravain wanted, at least not in the terms in which she wanted it. He understood her hunger for resolution, her exhaustion with the perpetual tension of maintained opposition, her absolute conviction that the Morthis bloodline was the correct inheritor of whatever the relic could bestow. He understood, and, in the abstract, even shared the conviction, but he feared the relic's ambiguity the way one fears a weapon that cannot distinguish between one's enemies and oneself. His communication with Aldrich had been, on the surface, simple, a request for mutual restraint, for the consideration of alternatives to the prophecy's apparent terminus. The alternatives that Voss proposed were not accommodations between the bloodlines. Neither he nor Aldrich was naive enough to propose that, and the history of such attempts was not a history that encouraged confidence. The alternatives had to do with the relic itself, with the possibility that the prophecy's ambiguity was not a flaw in the text but a feature, a door that the text's authors had left deliberately open. If the relic could be used not to decide the war between the bloodlines, but to dissolve the conditions that made the war necessary, if it were possible, however remote the possibility, to use the relic's power to rewrite the terms of the invisible world's balance, rather than to tip the balance in one bloodline's favor, then the ambiguous outcome, the extinction of both, might be avoidable, and the question of which bloodline prevailed might become less urgently catastrophic. This was the theory. It was, Voss knew, as much a construction of his fear as of his intelligence. It might be entirely wrong. The text might mean precisely what its most straightforward reading suggested. The relic might do precisely what Ceravain intended to use it for, and his attempts at communication with Aldrich might be exactly what they appeared to be, a betrayal of the Morthis bloodline, dressed in the clothing of strategic calculation. But he had made the communication, and now, moving through Vaelthorn Manor at Ceravain's side, feeling the heat of the red moon's light beginning to penetrate even the stone above, feeling the hours narrowing toward the prophesied zenith, Voss was aware of what he had done, and was aware of its likely consequences with a clarity that the long centuries of his existence had never quite managed to produce with such sharp, unambiguous edges. If Ceravain discovered the communication, she would not hesitate. She had never hesitated. It was one of the things he had always admired in her, and now, with abrupt and terrifying completeness, feared about her. The discovery came in the passage that Ceravain had not been able to penetrate on her previous visits, the passage concealed behind the carved wall of the upper crypt, the passage that led downward toward the deep chambers where the text was inscribed. She had found the passage's entrance on this occasion with unusual ease, as though the manor had decided on this particular night to be less resistant, to admit what it had always resisted. And this ease, which she experienced as a sign of her own power and the hour's correctness, was in reality the first evidence of Aldrich's changed position. He had opened the passage for her, not opened it in welcome. His opposition to her presence had not dissolved, would never dissolve, but opened it as a gesture, a statement of changed conditions, a demonstration that the game of the night had parameters he was setting rather than responding to. This was a subtle point, one that Seravain might or might not have grasped had she been attending to the Manor's behavior with her full intelligence rather than the partial attention of someone whose certainty of victory has made full attention feel excessive. She passed through the passage and into the deep chambers, and the text on the walls blazed at her. Not literally, not with light, but with meaning, with the press of language that even a reader as skilled as she was found overwhelming in the immediacy of its encounter, the full weight of what the stone said arriving all at once rather than in the measured increments that regular reading produced. She stopped. Her companions stopped behind her. Voss, just behind her left shoulder, felt the change in the air with every one of his centuries of attention. She read the text, read it with the hunger of someone who had been pursuing this room and this text for centuries, and was now, finally, in its presence. Read it in the flickering amber light of the single candle she held, the flame throwing complex shadows through the crowded letters on the curved walls, her amber eyes moving across the stone with an intensity that was the closest her face ever came to showing naked feeling. When she came to the passage about the relic, she stopped, read it again, read it a third time, and the third reading produced something in her posture, a very slight, very controlled shift in how her shoulders sat, in how her head angled, that Voss recognized. He had seen this shift twice in his centuries with her, and both times it had been followed within hours by violence that restructured the world around it. She had not found the information about Voss's communication in the text. The text contained no such information. What she found in the text was the location of the relic, described with a specificity she had not expected, in the section of the prophecy she had not previously been able to access, and what the text said about the relic's location corresponded precisely with what she had been told by Voss when he had explained to her over the course of the previous weeks, the layout of the lower crypts and the possible locations of the relic's chamber. Voss had told her nothing she had not already suspected, or had told her things that the text itself would have told her given access to the text. But the correspondence between his information and the text's information was precise in a way that exceeded coincidence, in a way that suggested his knowledge was not the product of independent research or reasonable deduction, but of access, direct access, specific access, access that would have required communication with the one being who knew the details with the specificity that the correspondence required. She did not turn around. She continued reading, and her stillness in the face of this understanding was the most frightening thing that Voss had ever seen in all his centuries of proximity to her, because her stillness was not the stillness of someone who had not yet understood, but the stillness of someone who had understood completely, and was choosing with absolute deliberate will the moment and manner of her response. The return from the deep chamber was accomplished in the same silence as the descent, but the silence had changed its quality entirely. Where the silence of the descent had been the silence of anticipation, of a mission unfolding according to its planned trajectory, the silence of the ascent was the silence of aftermath, of a reckoning held in suspension, of a verdict pronounced but not yet executed. Voss moved behind Seravain with the specific discipline of someone who understands that their survival in the next several hours depends on maintaining the appearance of normality, not because normality would protect them, but because the departure from normality would accelerate the violence they could not entirely prevent. He watched the set of her spine, the angle of her head, the particular economy of her movement, and read in each of these things the precise state of her interior, in the way that centuries of proximity to another being produces. Not mind-reading, not supernatural perception, simply the accumulated database of observed behavior, the long history of watching someone be themselves in every condition of crisis and triumph and ordinary duration. She knew, and knowing, she was moving now not simply toward the relic, but toward the resolution of multiple things simultaneously, with the characteristic Morthis approach to complexity, not by separating the strands and addressing each individually, but by identifying the point at which all strands could be severed with a single action. The manor above them was beginning to respond to the escalating tension with increasing visibility. The candle flames, as they ascended through the passage to the upper crypts, were burning in colors that candle flames did not produce. Deep blue at the base, shifting through purple to a red so intense it was almost infrared, pulsing rather than burning steadily. The carvings on the walls of the upper crypt had begun, and this was not perception or suggestion, but observation, verifiable and repeating, to move. Not dramatically, not in any way that would have been registered as motion by a casual glance, but with the slow, glacial movement of something shifting under enormous pressure, the faces in the bas-relief turning fractionally, the arms of carved figures adjusting their positions by increments invisible in any single moment, but accumulating, over the course of the ascent, into unmistakable repositioning. The manor was waking, not in the way Aldrich had woken, not as a single consciousness returning from quiescence, but in the more diffuse and therefore more alarming way of a large system coming to activation, the way a city wakes, not as a single entity but as a cascade of individual responses to a common stimulus, each element activating in sequence until the whole is alive with a cumulative consciousness that exceeds what any single part could produce alone. The confrontation began in the long gallery among the tapestries. It began not with Saravain and Aldrich. They had their own encounters timing, their own rhythm of approach and withdrawal that the centuries had shaped into something almost formal, a structure so deeply established that even the urgency of the prophesied hour could not entirely dissolve it. It began with the others, with the 6 who had come with Saravain, and the 3 who had emerged from the manor's deeper places at Aldrich's call, 3 Vaelthorn, who had been in their own quiescence in chambers scattered through the crypt, and who had woken at the pressure of his will through the blood, and who had arrived silent and cold in the upper levels of the manor in the hour since his own waking. Aldrich's 3 were not equivalent to Saravain's 6 in terms of number, but the arithmetic of their particular kind operated by different rules than the arithmetic of human armies. The 3 who had come at his call were ancient in their own right. Heval, whose particular gift was the manipulation of shadow, not the shadows that light produces, not the negative space created by an object's interruption of illumination, but the shadow as a substance in itself, the shadow that the invisible world cast on the visible, the dark that existed independent of any light source and that could be commanded as any substance is commanded by a will of sufficient power. And Sirene, whose gift was transformation, not the superficial shift of form that lesser beings achieved, the approximation of other shapes, the theatrical mist and the theatrical bat, but genuine cellular transformation, the complete reorganization of physical substance into something other, back and forward through multiple forms without the strain that such transmutation cost most transformers, and at a speed that made the transformation itself a weapon. And the 3rd, whose name was simply Null, or whose name had contracted to that single syllable over the centuries of use, who had the strangest gift of the 3, the ability to remove himself from perception, not through invisibility, not through any active deception of the senses, but through a kind of presence negation, a withdrawal from the register of other beings' awareness, so complete that he did not trigger the sense of absence that invisible things leave, but simply ceased, temporarily, to be a factor in the world. The encounter in the gallery began when one of Saravain's 6, the young one, young being a relative term that meant here something under 2 centuries, which in the context of the beings present was genuinely recent, moved ahead of the group toward the passage that led to the staircase, descending toward where the relic waited, and found Heval standing in his path among the tapestries, standing in the darkness between 2 candelabra, in a stillness indistinguishable from the stillness of the carved figures on the tapestries themselves, visible only because he chose to be visible, had stepped out of the shadow of shadows at the exact moment of encounter. What followed was not theatrical. There was no posturing, No warning, no communication of any kind. The young Morthis moved with the speed that their kind was capable of, moved in a blur of black motion that would have been invisible to any human eye, and Havel dissolved, not metaphorically dissolved. The shadow claimed him. He stepped backward into the dark between the candelabra and was not there, was not anywhere that the senses could locate, and the young Morthis passed through the space where Havel had stood and felt nothing, found nothing, continued toward the passage, and then stopped. Stopped completely, mid-stride, in a posture of movement arrested so absolutely that it was clearly not voluntary. Not the choice to stop, but the inability to continue, some force having claimed the muscles and the will simultaneously. Havel had not gone anywhere. He had gone into the shadow, and through the shadow and behind the young Morthis, had moved through the gallery's darkness the way a hand moves through water, and standing now behind the frozen figure, he was doing something that was entirely invisible, entirely without sound or light or any dramatic signature, something that operated entirely in the medium of shadow and was visible in its effect. The young Morthis, rigid and arrested, beginning to darken. Not to bruise, not in any biological sense, but to absorb the darkness around them, the shadow beginning to penetrate the substance of their form, the way water penetrates cloth, changing the color and the texture and eventually the fundamental nature of what it saturated. The others did not wait for the outcome. 3 of Serevaine's remaining 5 moved simultaneously in 3 directions, and the gallery became, in the space of 2 heartbeats, something that no tapestry had ever depicted, and no chronicle would ever adequately record, a space of absolute, complex violence conducted at inhuman speeds, by beings of inhuman power, in the darkness and candlelight of a hall hung with the history of their kind's long war. Sirene moved through 3 forms in the first minute of the gallery battle, and each form was chosen for tactical rather than theatrical reasons, not spectacle but strategy, the transformation of form of tactical thought, conducted at physical scale. In the first form she was herself, Sirene as she existed in her baseline expression, tall, spare, moving with a fluid economy that made human athleticism look arthritic. In this form, she caught the first of the Morthis who came for her and held him with the full force of her strength, and his own momentum used against him, leveraged into the wall with a crack of stone that sent visible fractures radiating across the carved reliefs, the serpents on the wall splitting through their carved coils, and the relief figures above fragmenting into falling shards of ancient stone. In the second form she was mist, not romantic mist, not the soft, passive fog of Gothic imagery, but mist with will and direction, mist that moved against the air currents rather than with them, that poured through the space with the purpose of something that knows where it is going and why. In this form she was inside the defensive arrangement of 3 Morthis before they had registered her dissolution, was within their formation and reforming, pulling herself back into solidity in the spaces between their bodies, where there was insufficient room for full human form, and what condensed in those spaces was not quite human form, but something with the key mechanical properties of human form: leverage, impact, the particular angles of force that joints and long bones and determined will can achieve. In the third form she was something older, something she rarely used, that she had used perhaps a dozen times in her centuries, that cost more than the others, and that committed her to the full expression of what she was, in a way the others did not. The third form was the form of the first things, of the beings that the bloodlines, in their distant origins, had made themselves from or had been made from, the templates for their particular kind of existence. It was not a bat, though the iconography of transformation used that image. It was not a wolf, though the instincts it awakened were lupine in their essentials. It was something that had no adequate word in any living language, something the deep chambers wall paintings had depicted in the old pigments, with a specificity that her third form bore out, a shape of compressed darkness and extended extremities, of height beyond normal height and reach beyond normal reach, of eyes that burned in the darkness with a light that was not light, but the inverse of light, the visible expression of will so concentrated, it bent the perceptual field around it. In this form, she occupied the gallery's central space, and two of the Morthis 5 who were still standing made the decision, simultaneously and independently, to move away from her rather than toward her. This was not cowardice. It was the specific calculation of beings old enough to recognize a force they would not survive engaging directly. Across the gallery, Null had become relevant. Null had been present since the moment the encounter began, present in the specific way that made him the most dangerous being in the gallery despite his inconspicuous absence. He was operating on those who did not know where he was, which was everyone except Hevel. He had moved through the battle without being detected, without triggering the peripheral awareness that beings of their kind maintained as a constant background process, without producing any of the signatures, no displacement of air, no interruption of ambient light, no perturbation of the blood that should have announced his activity. He was the dark between the dark, the silence beneath the silence of their collective stillness in motion. What he did to the Morthis he reached was quiet and absolute, a negation of self, imposed from without, not destruction, not the violence of Haval's shadow work or Siren's impact. The Morthis that Null touched experienced briefly the removal of their own certainty of existence, a few seconds of radical doubt, of the foundations of self-knowledge suddenly uncertain, of the anchor that connected will to action suddenly gone slack. In those few seconds they were entirely neutralized, reduced to pure experience without agency, and in those seconds other things happened to them that did not require the additional narration of specificity. While the gallery behind her became the site of a battle whose sounds, such as they were, the impacts and the supernatural frequencies, and the low, sustained note that very old beings under extreme conditions produce, a sound felt in the chest rather than heard in the ears, penetrated every wall of the manor. Cerevane descended. She went alone. She had separated from Voss in the gallery, had not explained the separation, had not indicated its significance with any visible sign, had simply moved ahead of him with a purpose that did not include him, that had edited him from the equation without announcement. Voss had registered this separation with the cold clarity of understanding. He was not included in the descent because she no longer trusted what he would do in proximity to the relic. He was not killed in the gallery because his usefulness had not yet fully expired, because there were still circumstances in the next several hours in which his knowledge and his power might serve purposes that she had already identified. He was left in the gallery to participate in the battle as he chose or as he was forced to, which served the double purpose of occupying him and contributing to the Morthis effort above, and his potential treachery was being managed not by confrontation but by exclusion, by the simple expedient of removing him from the critical location at the critical moment. This was Cerevane at her most characteristic, not the violent intensity of the Morthis style, not the blood and motion expression of her bloodline's deepest nature, but the intelligence that had always existed beneath that expression, and that had, across the centuries, proven as lethal as any more direct application of power. She was going to get the relic, and she was going to get it not by fighting her way through everything between her and it, but by having positioned herself, through months of planning and the centuries of strategic investment that had produced those months, at the point where she was already inside the manor's deepest defenses, already past the obstacles, already arriving at the chamber, with her hand outstretched before anyone on the other side of the conflict fully understood where she was. The passage to the relic's chamber opened for her the way it had opened for Aldrich, not with welcome, but with recognition, the wards reading something in her that compelled their dissolution, despite the fact that she was not the one who had built them. She descended with the red moon at the height it would reach before its zenith, knowing she had perhaps 2 hours. She was met in the passage that led to the relic's chamber by Eldrick. He stood in the passage the way he had stood in the vaulted chamber above, with the absolute comprehensive stillness that was both his nature and his most direct expression of power, the air around him so still that the single candle he held burned without the slightest motion of its flame, a vertical line of light that could have been painted on the air for all the evidence it gave of any atmosphere. He was taller than the passage's proportions made comfortable, his head within inches of the ceiling, and in this constricted space his presence was both more intimate and more overwhelming than in the chambers above, the full force of what he was compressed into close proximity without the relief of distance. She stopped, not from hesitation. She had not hesitated in centuries, could not recall the subjective experience of hesitation any more clearly than one recalls the flavor of meals eaten in a previous life, but from the particular quality of strategic assessment that replaced hesitation, for beings old enough to have learned that the appearance of pause, of consideration, of the willingness to take time, was itself a form of power. She stopped, and she looked at him, and the amber of her eyes met whatever was in his eyes, and the space between them became, for a moment, the most concentrated and most compressed version of everything that their centuries of opposition had been. She had not, in all those centuries, been able to read him entirely. This was the most reliable source of respect she had ever felt for any being, the recognition of a depth she could not fully plumb, a complexity she could not fully map, a resistance that was not merely the resistance of opposing will, but the resistance of something genuinely different from herself, something that shared her nature and contradicted it with equal force. She had hated him with the precision of someone who knows exactly what they hate and why, and beneath the hatred had maintained, without ever acknowledging it, the equally precise recognition of what he was. He was, she knew, had always known, the only being whose assessment of her mattered, not because she required validation, not because she was uncertain of her own worth, but because he was the only being who had the context to assess her fully. He had seen everything. He had been present in some form or another for every significant event of her long existence, had been the opposition against which she had defined herself, the standard against which her power had always been measured. Without him, she was enormous in a world of small things. With him, she was precisely herself, no more, no less, in a world that contained her equal. None of this changed anything about what she was here to do. He moved aside. This was not the surrender it appeared to be. He moved aside with the deliberateness of something that knows exactly what it is doing and has decided, after the full weight of its centuries of consideration, to permit what it is permitting. He did not speak. They had not spoken to each other in this, their direct encounter, but the movement was communication of a precision that language had rarely achieved in their interactions. She could pass, it said. The relic awaited. The prophesied hour came on, and he would meet her in the relic's chamber, not as obstacle but as witness, because whatever the prophecy intended, whatever the stone said, he was not going to allow the conclusion to happen without being present for it. She descended past him and he followed, and the passage closed behind them both. The chamber received them both in its plain, circular completeness, the relic on its plinth glowing with its subsurface shimmer, its dark metal surface moving in slow, iridescent waves that were, in the enclosed space, brighter than they appeared in memory. The single candle Aldrich carried was insufficient to the chamber's needs, but provided in its limited golden circle the specific quality of light that the place required, intimate, ancient, the light of a confrontation that had been inevitable for longer than any candles burning. Saravain crossed the chamber and stood before the relic and did not touch it. Not yet. She stood before it in the way one stands before something that one has pursued across centuries, not with triumph, not with the ecstasy of possession, but with the complex stillness of arrival, of having reached the place that has been the destination of everything, and finding it simultaneously smaller and vaster than any anticipation had managed. Aldrich stood at the chamber's entrance. Between them the relic pulsed, and the pulse was not a heartbeat. It was the pulse of the blood itself, of the invisible medium in which they both existed, and through which they both felt everything that was happening in the manor above. The battle in the gallery, escalating now into corridors and chambers, the sounds of ancient violence transmitted through stone, as that deep vibration that had marked the night's beginning, now continuous and building. Sirene in her third form, Havel's shadows spreading through the upper crypt in ways that blurred the boundaries of the carved spaces, Null moving through it all like a blank note in a complex chord, and Voss, whom Seravain had not killed and had not trusted, making his own decisions now in the gallery above, having been removed from the equation in one way and reinserting himself in another, because beings of his age and his investment did not exit equations simply because they had been removed from a specific position within them. Voss was deciding what to do with the few hours that remained, and the nature of his decision was not yet clear, not even to him. The competing weights of loyalty and fear and the specific kind of wisdom that only beings of very great age achieve still in the process of resolution. In the chamber, Aldrich approached the plinth. He approached it from the other side, and they stood now with the relic between them, equidistant, the chamber perfectly bisected. The geography of centuries rendered in the positions of their bodies around the object that both of them had, in their separate ways and for their separate reasons, refused to use. The red moon was moving toward its zenith. The prophecy had said what it had said. Aldrich had read it for centuries. Seravain had read it once, tonight, and had read it as she read everything, with complete retention, with immediate integration into everything she already knew, with the application of an intelligence that had been refining itself for longer than most bloodlines had existed. She had read it once and knew it completely, and had arrived at her interpretation of its ambiguity with a confidence that was, he thought, either the confidence of genuine insight or the confidence of someone who had decided what they wanted the text to mean and had interpreted accordingly. Her interpretation? The ambiguity was not genuine. The language that suggested the possibility of mutual extinction was not a description of a likely outcome, but a warning attached to a specific misuse of the relic, a warning that applied to any attempt to use the relic without the full authority of the prophecy's chosen bloodline, and was therefore entirely relevant to any Vaelthorn attempt to use it and entirely irrelevant to Morthis' use. Her bloodline was the chosen inheritor. The text said so in the passages that described the moving blood, with a vocabulary of elevation and priority that, when read in the context of the full prophecy, when interpreted through the linguistic framework she had spent decades constructing, was unambiguous. His interpretation. The ambiguity was the point. The text's authors had not chosen their language carelessly. The warning of mutual extinction was not a conditional threat, but a description of the relic's nature. It was not a weapon that could be aimed, not a force that could be directed exclusively at one target while preserving another. It was a key to a lock that, when turned, opened a door that could not be opened partially. What came through that door would be everything, not a portion of everything, and everything included both of them and more than both of them. They faced each other across the relic, and these incompatible interpretations faced each other across the centuries that separated their construction, and neither moved because neither could yet see the path from this moment to the next moment that was not entirely catastrophic. What no one in the deep chamber could yet know was that Voss had chosen. He had spent the battle in the gallery on the margins of it, which was unusual enough to register with those present who had the attention to spare for registration. Voss on the margins of a battle, Voss not fully committed, Voss moving through the combat space with the careful conservation of someone keeping options open. He had engaged where engagement was unavoidable, had deflected where deflection was possible, had maintained throughout the sustained quality of attention that looked to Sirene across the gallery's chaotic space, like calculation. He was calculating. He was calculating the specific question of what the relic's use would produce, not in terms of the prophecy's abstract claims, but in terms of the concrete reality of the power that would be released in the hours remaining before the red moon's zenith. He was calculating it with the tool available to him that wasn't available to either Seravain or Aldrich. He had been present in the very early centuries of his existence for an event that bore not structural similarity, but a functional similarity, a similarity of scale and consequence to what the prophecy described as the outcome of the relic's use. He had been present for it as a young thing, as a being barely past the shock of his own making, and the memory of it was the most complete memory he possessed. Complete in the sense that he had not processed it, had not reduced it to summary and filed it in the archives of the centuries, but had carried it whole and undimmed through every year since, as one carries a wound that never fully closes. The event had not been the relic. It had been something else, something different in its mechanism but similar in its scale, and it had produced what the text on the stone wall below him described with its ambiguous grammar. Not the extinction of a single target, but the extinction of the conditions that supported the existence of everything involved, a collapse of the invisible world structure in the affected region that had taken centuries to rebuild, and had left the landscape of that region permanently altered in ways that were still, if you knew how to see them, visible in the behavior of the blood in that area, in the particular quality of its disturbance, the faint echo of the original collapse persisting through the centuries. He had been trying to prevent this. His communication with Aldrich had been an attempt to create a third option, to introduce into the binary of use and outcome the possibility of non-use, of the clock running past the zenith without the relic being activated, the prophesied hour passing and the prophecy failing of its own inertia. If neither bloodline used the relic at the zenith, the conditions the prophecy required would dissolve, the specific alignment of powers would disperse, and the next opportunity, the next red moon of this cycle, the next convergence, was centuries away. But Saravain was in the chamber below with the relic, and the moon was approaching its zenith, and the option of non-use was no longer in Voss's power to ensure alone. He made a decision, and the decision required him to move in the direction of the passage that descended to the deep chamber, and moving in that direction in the current state of the gallery required him to commit, fully and without reservation, to the violence that his calculated marginal position had so far allowed him to avoid. He committed. The gallery battle, which had been sustained at an extraordinary pitch for what would have felt like hours to any human observer with the misfortune to be present, underwent a fracture at the moment of Voss's commitment, not because his power was decisive. The gallery battle was already beyond the point where any single participant's decision could tip it cleanly, but because his transition from margin to center changed the geometry of the space in the way that the introduction of a new gravitational body changes an orbital system, not breaking the orbits but distorting them, pulling trajectories into new paths, some of which were stable and some of which were not. 2 of Saravain's 5 surviving companions registered the change and adjusted. 2 others, more committed to their original engagement, did not. Of those who did not adjust, 1 was caught in the new geometry at a disadvantageous angle, and what happened to that one was the first real conclusion of the gallery battle. Not incapacitation, not the temporary neutralization that Null's work produced, but actual ending, the kind that centuries of existence cannot recover from, the kind that leaves nothing remaining except the brief, cold signature in the blood that marks the departure of an old consciousness from the world. The survivor's signature of this ending spread through the blood, and was felt simultaneously in the gallery and in the deep chamber below, and in the deep chamber it was felt by both occupants as the simultaneous signal of what the battle had entered and what the clock's approach to zenith required. Saravain reached for the relic. Her hand closed around the chalice and the chamber screamed. Not in any acoustic sense. There was no sound. The chamber's silence was absolute, the deep stone absorbing every potential vibration before it could become audible. It screamed in the blood, in the invisible medium, in the substrate of supernatural existence that connected every being in the manor and through the manor to the wider world. It was the scream of a lock turning, of a mechanism activating that had been still for so long that its activation was itself a kind of violence. The screaming of hinges that had not moved in centuries and whose motion now was both liberation and damage. Aldrich moved. He had not moved, had been still, stillness being his nature and his power, the cold fire of absolute cessation, and then he was moving, and the movement was unlike any movement of his stillness-trained body, urgent, committed, crossing the distance between them in the time it took the relic's first pulse of activated power to expand outward from Saravain's grip. His hand closed over hers, closed over her hand on the relic, closed not to take it from her but to join the contact, to introduce his own power into the circuit that her touch had opened. This was not strategy. This was not the calculated move of a being who had spent centuries considering this moment. This was the response of something that had spent centuries considering this moment and had, in the actual moment, abandoned the calculation entirely and moved according to something older than calculation, something that recognized in the relic's awakening the exact sound he had been dreading, the sound that matched the ambiguous grammar of the text, the sound that said not victory but ending, and had responded to it with the instinct of something that, despite all the centuries of its cold, preserved, carefully managed existence, was not willing to end. Their joined contact on the relic produced something neither had anticipated. The relic received two simultaneous claims, two incompatible authorities, two ancient wills of near-equivalent power asserting simultaneously the right to direct the force that the activation had released. It received these claims with the impartiality of a mechanism that has been designed for a single input and has received two. The response was catastrophic. Not catastrophic in the metaphorical sense of very large consequences, though the consequences were very large. Catastrophic in the technical sense. A system failure, a cascade of uncontrolled release, the force that had been contained in the relic for the centuries since its last activation, now releasing not in the directed, purposeful way that either of them had intended, but in the omnidirectional, undirected way of something that has lost its steering and is operating entirely on momentum. The power came up through the stone. It came up through the black rock of the deep chamber, up through the passages, up through the painted corridors, up through the carved crypts, up through the floors of the cellar and into the manor above with a velocity that was felt before it was perceived. A pressure wave that expanded outward from the relic's chamber at a speed that the manor's stones slowed but did not stop. It reached the gallery in time for Voss to feel it and to understand, in the fraction of a second available to him before it arrived at full force, that he had been right about what the relic's activation by competing wills would produce, that his centuries of fear had been accurate fear, and not the paranoia that others had occasionally implied, and that there was nothing to be done about this understanding at this particular moment. The power hit the gallery the way a great wave hits a shoreline, not destructively initially, but with a presence that rearranged everything, that pushed every being in the gallery to the edges of their own capacity, that lit the blood in each of them with an intensity that was simultaneously ecstasy and suffering, the over-illumination of a medium usually experienced at more measured intensities. Sirene, in her third form, roared, the sound of it not sound but presence, a pressure in the chest of every being in the gallery, a vibration in the stone. Heval's shadows, which had spread through the gallery in a complex web of sustained effort, dissolved all at once, the power of their maintenance overwhelmed by the flood from below, and the gallery's candle flames went out simultaneously, and the darkness that replaced them was absolute. In the absolute darkness, the combatants moved by blood sense and by the memory of the space and by instinct, and what happened in the gallery in the seconds of darkness was abbreviated and conclusive in ways that the previous hours of sustained combat had not been. The manor began to fail from the inside outward. The deep chambers, absorbing the relic's uncontrolled release at closest range, showed the first and worst damage. The black stone walls, which had stood unchanged through centuries of occupation and millennia of geological pressure, cracked. Not the hairline cracks of ordinary stress. These were deep, rapid fractures that propagated through the stone with the speed of the release that caused them. The sound of each fracture, not a sharp crack, but a sustained low groan, the voice of ancient rock giving way to forces it had not been constructed to withstand. The paintings on the walls, the ochre and charcoal and old blood that had preserved their vivid specificity through centuries, lost their adherence all at once, the pigment releasing from the stone surface and drifting downward through the fracturing air in flakes that were visible even in the absence of light, catching some quality of the power's release that made them faintly luminescent as they fell. The ceiling of the deep chamber fell in sections. not in sudden collapse, but in the staged disintegration of something whose integrity has been critically undermined, each section giving way after a brief interval of increased groaning that served as a kind of warning, a warning that neither Aldrich nor Seravain was in a position to respond to adequately, because the relic between them was still activating, still releasing, and the contact of their joined hands on it was still feeding the cycle. Their attempts to withdraw, both of them attempting to withdraw simultaneously in the same horrified recognition of what was happening, frustrated by the way the relic had claimed them, had incorporated their contact into its circuit in a way that their individual will could not simply revoke. The power that rose through the manor from the deep chamber below changed the character of every space it passed through. In the upper crypts, the sarcophagi of the false dead shook in their positions, and several slid from their pedestals, the carved lids splitting on impact with the stone floor, revealing the emptiness inside. And the emptiness was real, was literal. The stone cases containing nothing had always contained nothing, the cenotaphs that marked absence rather than presence now revealing their emptiness without the containing dignity of their intact forms. In the long gallery the tapestries moved, lifted from the walls by the pressure wave passing through the space, the ancient wool billowing outward from the stone and catching the power that moved through the air, the way sails catch wind, filling with it, the scenes woven into the wool appearing, in this bizarre animation, to move, the red-threaded spaces between the two opposing forces in the largest tapestry flowing like actual liquid, the figures of the two armies moving in the wool's billowing surge. The grand ballroom above the crypt sustained particular violence. The floor, the white and black and dark red marble, the geometric pattern that resolved from above into the esoteric design, cracked along the dark red veins of the pattern first, the inlaid marble following the lines of its own design in splitting, the pattern revealing itself to be something more than aesthetic, a structural diagram of force lines, and the force lines breaking first when the force they had been designed to carry exceeded their capacity. The fallen crystal of the old chandelier's remains, scattered across the floor from its century-old collapse, was set in vibration by the power rising through the stone, each crystal drop resonating at a frequency that produced collectively the closest thing to a sound that the relic's release generated on the human audible scale. A high, continuous singing, not beautiful, not ugly, entirely inhuman, the voice of glass under strain, the voice of something about to break. The stained glass windows of the ballroom held longer than seemed possible, their ancient leading and medieval glass demonstrating a resilience that spoke of whatever had originally been woven into their construction. Some ward, some preservation embedded in the glass itself by whoever had commissioned the windows, by whoever had known, in the centuries of the manor's construction, that the night depicted in the central window's central image would arrive, and had tried, with the materials and techniques available, to ensure that the record of it would survive. The central figure in the central window, the ancient regal form with the chalice in its outstretched hand, held in the leaded glass until the powers second. Larger wave came up through the stone, and then the windows blew outward into the night, the leading bending and the glass fragmenting and the pieces of the central figure scattering into the cold air of the forecourt, the red glass blood from the chalice's rim catching the red moonlight as the pieces fell and returning it upward in a brief, brilliant spray of crimson light before the fragments hit the frozen ground. Voss reached the passage to the deep chamber during the second wave's passage through the manor. He reached it as the passage itself was fracturing, the ceiling of the upper crypt section of the passage cracking in deep lateral breaks, sections of stone dropping in slow, heavy pieces to the floor, each impact sending reverberations through the stone that met and interfered with the reverberations already propagating from below. He moved through the falling stone with the speed that his kind could achieve, and with the particular attention of someone who has accepted that their survival is secondary to their purpose, that the physical risk of the passage is irrelevant against the weight of what requires doing below. What he carried was knowledge, the specific knowledge of the one case he had studied, the functional analog to the current situation, the event from his early centuries that had never left him whole. He carried the knowledge of what had stopped it, what had been done in that earlier case, in the moment of uncontrolled release, by beings who had been present for it as he had and who had responded not with withdrawal, not with the attempt to take back what had been activated, but with addition, the introduction of more contact, more will, more concentration of blood power into the circuit of the activation, in sufficient quantity to overwhelm the mechanism's resistance and to force a direction onto what had been undirected. They had not saved everything. They had saved enough. They had stopped the cascade before it consumed the entire structure of the invisible world in the affected region, had redirected the release into a form that expressed rather than destroyed, and what had been lost, the young Morthis who had touched the activating object, the two Vaelthorn who had joined the effort to redirect it, consumed in the moment of resolution, had been, in the calculus of that terrible moment, the price of everything else. He descended through the cracking passage and into the deep chamber and found it in the state it was in. Ceiling fragments on the floor, the painted walls cracking and flaking, Aldrich and Saravane joined to the relic in a circuit of activation that neither of them could break individually. Their faces turned toward each other across the charged space between them, across the relic they both held and neither could release, wearing expressions that he had not seen on either of those faces in all the centuries of his knowledge of them. Not pain, though the pain was present, not fear, though the fear was present. Something beneath both, something more fundamental, the expression of beings confronting the end of the long story they had been telling about each other, the expression of the recognition that the story's ending was not the ending either of them had imagined across the centuries of its telling. He added his hands to the relic, the three of them together, still blood and moving blood and the old being caught between them, the being who had for centuries occupied the uncomfortable and essential position of someone who understood both sides too well to fully belong to either, redirected the relic's release in the way that the analog had suggested, and in the way that Voss's terror and his hope and his centuries of specific preparation had equipped him to guide. The release found a direction, not a direction toward either bloodline, not the victory the prophecy had promised one of them and the destruction it had threatened both. The direction was something the prophecy had not named, had not had a name for, had possibly not anticipated. The direction of dissolution, of the release of held tension rather than the resolution of it into a new tension. The force that the relic contained was not a weapon after all, or not only a weapon, it was a concentration of the original blood, of the power that had existed before the two bloodlines had differentiated from their common origin, and what it expressed when redirected by three different wills in the moment of its release was not the dominance of one quality over another, but the brief, violent, burning reunion of qualities that had been separated for centuries, separated by the differentiation, by the making of the still blood and the making of the moving blood from a single source that had been neither still nor moving but both. The reunion lasted seconds. It lasted what it lasted, which was long enough to send the relic's power through both of them simultaneously and through Voss between them, and the Manor above them expressed the passage of this force by failing further and more dramatically than it had failed already. The west tower collapsed, its stones falling outward into the forecourt with a prolonged, grinding thunder that sent the ravens from their perches in a black explosion of wings. The east wing, already partial in its structural integrity, gave way in a single catastrophic subsidence, the entire wing dropping several feet and then cracking apart, its interior walls falling in, its exterior walls following moments later in a cascade of stone and timber and the accumulated centuries of everything that had been stored or installed or simply abandoned in the wing spaces across its life. The staircase held, the central keep held, the great entrance hall held, the iron candelabra still standing in their positions, their candles extinguished by the force waves that had passed through the space, the darkness complete and total. When the relic's release was complete, When the activation had run its course and the chalice on its plinth was again dark, its surface no longer moving, its color returned to the flat darkness of very old iron, 3 beings stood in the fractured chamber beneath the ruined manor and breathed. Breathed not because they required the oxygen, but because breathing was what their forms defaulted to in the aftermath of something that had used everything else. The blood sense that told them each of the other's survival also told them, in the minutes that followed the release's completion, the broader account of the night's costs. In the gallery above, 2 of Seravain's companions had not survived the battle and its intersection with the relic's release. 2 of Aldrich's 3 had. In the collapsed east wing, 1 of Seravain's had been in the wing when it fell, had been there by chance, by the decision to use the wing's passage as a route of strategic withdrawal, and the wing had fallen. And what the wing's fall produced was the kind of ending that no amount of ancient power recovers from. In the forecourt, the ravens were returning, settling on the rubble of the collapsed tower in 1s and 2s, their orange eyes moving through the dark and paired points of amber light. Hival was alive. Sirene had returned from her 3rd form, an exhausting return, the dissolution of that form into the baseline always more costly than the transformation from it, requiring a period of reduced capacity that she was managing carefully in the partial collapse of the upper crypt passage. Noel had emerged from his non-presence into presence in the gallery, solid again and fully himself, regarding the devastated gallery space with the particular expression of someone who has survived something that others have not, and is managing the specific quality of relief that this survival produces. Of Seravain's 6, 2 survived, both at the older end of the group's range, both injured in ways that would require significant time to recover from, both currently in the gallery's remaining intact section, managing their conditions with the methodical self-repair that beings of their age could undertake. Seravain herself stood in the deep chamber and looked at her hand, the hand that had held the relic, that still held the relic in the sense that the relic's contact had left a record in her skin, not a burn in any biological sense, but something that showed in the quality of the skin, in the way light would have moved across it, a faint alteration that was visible to her own eyes and would be visible, she knew, to Aldrich's and to anyone else of their kind who looked closely enough. He had the same mark. They both did. Voss had it too. He looked at his hands, at both of them, turned palms up in the darkness of the cracked chamber, and the marks on his palms were the same marks, and the experience of making the same marks, of having been the conduit through which 2 incompatible powers had been made briefly to flow together, sat in his body as the most specific and complete thing he had ever felt, the thing he would carry for whatever centuries remained to him as the definitive experience against which all other experiences would be measured. They gathered in the gallery because it was the largest space with an intact ceiling, and because the gallery was, in the hierarchy of the manor's spaces, the space in which encounters between them had most often occurred. The tapestries a fitting backdrop for the specific quality of aftermath that the night had produced. The tapestries had not fallen. They had moved, had billowed in the force waves that had swept through the space, and several had suffered damage. Torn sections where the force had been too concentrated, faded sections where the activation's light equivalent had bleached the ancient dyes. But they still hung, still showed their scenes, still deployed their narrative of the long war across the gallery's walls. The surviving parties of both bloodlines occupied the gallery in positions that were not peaceful and not hostile, but something more complex than either, something that the centuries had not previously produced between them. A shared space after a shared crisis, the territory of aftermath in which the familiar structures of opposition had been, not dissolved, not replaced, complicated. They had not achieved peace. Peace would have required a transformation of their natures that the night's events had not produced. However dramatically those events had altered other things. What they had achieved was something less comfortable than peace, and more real, the shared knowledge of what the relic was and what its use had done, and what the prophecy had meant and what the night's red moon had actually required of them. The prophecy had said the war would be decided. It had not specified how. It had not specified that deciding meant winning. The decision was this, that what the relic held was not the power to end the other bloodline, but the power to demonstrate the cost of their opposition to each other, the cumulative price of the centuries of war and cold standoff, and the long exhausting investment of will and time and existence in the maintenance of enmity. The price the night had shown was the manor. Was the east wing in rubble in the forecourt? Was the west tower collapsed? Was the gallery's damaged tapestries and the ballroom's shattered windows and the scattered crystal on the broken marble floor? Was the specific individuals who had ended during the night's battle, their signatures in the blood present only as absences now, the particular flavor of their ancient selves remaining only as the trace memory that the blood maintained for a time after ending? Was the marks on 3 sets of hands in the candleless gallery before dawn? She did not leave through the west tower. It no longer had a door. She gathered her 2 survivors to her and moved through the entrance hall, the candelabra dark and cold now, the marble floor still beautiful despite the plaster debris fallen from the damaged ceiling. And she moved through the entrance hall, the way she moved through everything, with possession, but possession of a different quality than the possession that had brought her here, not the possession of arrival, of claiming, of the hand extended toward the object that had been the destination, a possession more akin to inheritance, of someone walking through a space that is already theirs, not because they have won it, but because they have survived it, because the space is marked by their passage in ways that cannot now be erased. At the entrance doors, she stopped, not from hesitation. She had not hesitated in centuries, from the specific quality of attentiveness that constituted her version of reflection, the pause that served in a being who did not doubt and did not waver, as the functional equivalent of those lesser operations. She looked back at the entrance hall, at the portrait gallery visible through the arch to the right, at the portraits of the Vaelthorn generations looking out from their frames with their deep-set garnet-burning eyes, at the single statue on the staircase landing with its armored form and its remarkable stone face, at the motif of the serpent consuming its own tail, repeated in the balustrade's carved decoration, the eternity symbol that was also the symbol of something that consumed itself from within, that sustained itself by the endless recycling of its own nature. She turned and left, and the darkness of the entrance hall closed behind her in the particular way that darkness closes behind a departing presence, not filling the space she had occupied, but re-establishing itself in the shape of her absence, the negative space where she had been briefly illuminated by the fact of her having been there. He remained. This was not a decision, not a choice made from options. He remained because the manor was his and because remaining was what he did, what he had always done, the expression of the deepest principle of his nature applied to the most specific and most personally comprehensive context available to it. He walked through the manor after the others were gone, walked through the ruined and the surviving sections, walked through the entrance hall and the gallery and what remained of the upper crypt and through the passage to the deep chambers. And what he walked through was not a defeat and not a victory and not precisely either of the things the prophecy had described. He walked through aftermath, through the specific aftermath of an ancient conflict that had arrived at its prophesied conclusion, and found that conclusion to be nothing like what had been imagined across the centuries of preparation. The deep chambers were cracked, but standing. The black stone had fractured in places, long, deep splits that ran diagonally across the carved faces of the walls, bisecting the old paintings, cutting through the text that occupied the narrowing passages. The text was damaged now in several of the critical passages, the stone that bore it cracked, and in places fallen, the ancient language of the prophecy interrupted in mid-statement by geological violence. He looked at the damaged text and felt something that might, in a human, have been irony, the prophecy broken by its own fulfillment. The relic on its plinth in the deepest chamber was unchanged. This was itself a remarkable thing. Everything around it damaged, the ceiling cracked, 2 sections of wall fractured from floor to ceiling, and the relic sitting on its plinth with the same quiet, flat darkness it had always had, as though the night's events had been entirely beneath its notice, as though it had done what it had done and was now simply done. He stood before it and looked at it, and the mark on his palm when he held his hand up between his face and the relic was barely visible in the darkness, a trace, a residue, something that would fade slowly over the decades, or might not fade at all, might be the permanent record of the specific moment when the thing that had defined the long centuries of his existence had changed its terms without his consent, and possibly, in ways that were not entirely without benefit to something he could not yet name, but could feel in the same place. He felt the cold and the blood and the Manor's damaged presence around him. The possibility, faint as the mark on his palm, persistent as stone. The ravens returned to the rubble of the west tower before the gray light of dawn touched the treetops. They returned with the particular comfort of creatures whose home has been damaged but not destroyed, whose attachment to a place survives the place's alteration because the attachment is not to the place's perfect form, but to the place's specific presence, its smell and temperature and the quality of its silence. They found their roosts in the rubble and the still-standing sections of crumbling battlements and settled there. And their settling was the most ordinary thing that happened in the Manor's surrounds that night, the most human-scaled thing, the thing that most closely resembled the continuation of ordinary life. The forest at dawn was still. The trees that had been still through the night were still now, their warped and expressive trunks catching the first gray light, with the same ambiguous presence they had always had, the same suggestion of faces, of attention, of a witnessing that the forest had maintained through centuries of proximity to the Manor and everything the Manor contained. The road through the forest was the same road, the same sunken stones, the same moss, the same memory of wheel ruts that it had always been, its disuse unchanged by the night's events, its invitation to approach remaining as conditional and as ambiguous as ever. The stained glass that had blown outward from the ballroom windows lay in the forecourt, and in the forecourt's frozen grass, and in the dry basin of the broken fountain. The pieces of the central figure, the regal, ancient form with the outstretched hand and the chalice that bled, lay scattered across the stones, and in the grey light before dawn, the crimson glass pieces were dark, indistinguishable in color from the other fragments. Only their particular density and their specific curved surfaces indicating that they had been part of something ordered, something designed, something that had held a meaning in its assembly that the disassembly had not entirely destroyed, that lay present in the scattered pieces as a potential for reconstruction that might or might not ever be realized. Inside the Manor, in the dark of the entrance hall, the iron candelabra still stood. They stood in their positions along the walls, cold and unlit, their wax hardened and cold, the black candles reduced to stumps in most cases. In the grey dawn light that began very slowly to enter through the high windows of the entrance hall, the windows that had not blown out, that still held their imperfect medieval glass, the candelabra cast shadows on the marble floor. The shadows of their branching iron arms extended across the black and white marble in patterns that were not the patterns of the serpent motif or the geometric floor inlay, but something less organized and more honest. The shadows of objects that had served their purpose and were now resting in the cold and the quiet of a morning after. On the staircase landing, the armored statue still stood on its plinth. The serpents of the balustrade still coiled around each other in their perpetual consumption. The garnet eyes of the carved serpents still caught the arriving light and returned it in points of deep red brilliance, the same color they had returned through centuries of candlelight, the same color they would return through whatever light was available to them for whatever time remained. In the deep chamber, the relic sat in its darkness, and the darkness sat around it, and the long morning before any new day began accumulated in the stone the way all the other mornings had accumulated, slowly, patiently, with the infinite inhuman persistence of time working on things that had decided long ago that they were not going to end. The red moon sank toward the western horizon, its color deepening as it descended, moving from the red of blood to the red of old iron, the red of rust, the red of something that had once been vivid and was becoming, gradually and without complaint, the earth color of everything that persists. The mana breathed, it breathed as it had always breathed, in the long cycles of occupation and abandonment, of battle and stillness, of burning intensity and cold quiescence. And the breath it drew in the grey light of that specific dawn, the dawn after the prophesied night, was different from any previous breath in the sense that all breaths that follow great exhalations are different, depleted, relieved, emptied of the specific burden that had been held through all the previous breaths, carrying now only the residue of that burden and the space where the burden had been, a space that was not empty but was, for the first time in centuries, available for whatever came next. In the forest the trees stood in their silence and the road wound toward the tree line, and the light grew very slowly from grey to the silver of a winter dawn, and nothing moved in the forecourt except the cold wind that had finally begun, in the hours before morning, to come down from the north, bearing with it the smell of deep forest and dark earth, and the stone-cold, blood-warm, ancient patient smell of a world that had been here before its current inhabitants and would be hereafter, that contained in its deep geological patience the compressed record of everything that had ever happened on its surface and in its depths, a record written not in language, but in the physical evidence of consequence, in the altered chemistry of air and stone and water, that documented the presence of things that had lived and fought and endured and changed, but had not ended. Not yet,